Morning, and can I welcome everyone to the fourth meeting of 2021 of the Social Security Committee. Full house this morning, no apologies have been received, and we start with agenda item 1, decision to take items in private, and the committee is asked to agree that item 6, consideration of evidence that we'll hear today in private. I'm going to assume that's agreed unless someone indicates otherwise in the chat box. They haven't done so, so that is agreed, and move to agenda item 2, Budget Scrutiny 2021-2022. The committee will take evidence in the Scottish Government's Budget 21-22 for Social Security. And can I welcome Shirley Ann Somerville, Cabinet Secretary for Social Security and Older People, and her officials, Kevin Stevens, Head of Strategic and Programme Finance, Social Security Directorate, and James Wallace, Deputy Director Finance and Corporate Services, Social Security Scotland. And can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement before we move to questions? Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Convener. I'm pleased to appear before the committee today to discuss the Social Security budget. In looking to the next year, I'm proud of the Social Security provision that we have completed and that we will continue to provide to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on people's lives and livelihoods. From your recent inquiry, I know the committee will be aware of the challenges people across Scotland face due to the pandemic. Social Security is but a part of a range of support this government has developed to assist people on low incomes during the pandemic, and will continue to do so when life gets back to normal. While much of Social Security spending remains reserved, the Scottish Government has responded to this increased need with new and expanded forms of support. In 2021, we increased our investment in the Scottish Welfare Fund, distributing £57.5 million to ensure support is available for those in need. We introduced the £500 self-isolation support grant and supported carers with an additional one-off coronavirus carers allowance supplement payment of £230.10, doubling the payment which eligible carers received at that point. Through the pandemic, Social Security Scotland has, of course, continued to pay people the money that they rely on. At the same time, we introduced 3 benefits, starting with Job Start Payment, which will support around 5,000 young people a year in starting a new job after a period of unemployment. We delivered payments of child winter heating assistance to children and young people in time for winter. In November, the Scottish Child Payment for under 60s opened for applications, and I'm delighted that the first payments will start this month. We're investing £68 million into this game-changing new benefit, which will be instrumental in tackling child poverty, paying families £40 every 4 weeks for every eligible child. It is the biggest benefit we have introduced to date and has been delivered at an unprecedented pace. In 21-22, Social Security remains at the heart of the Scottish Government's response to COVID-19 and our commitment to building a fairer and more equal society as we recover from the pandemic. I was pleased to see this approach shared in the committee's pre-budget scrutiny recommendations. To deliver this, the Social Security and Older People portfolio has been increased by 7.1% to £4 billion. Of this, £3.5 billion will go directly to over 800,000 people in Scotland, including through the first of our major disability benefits. This summer, we will introduce a child disability payment, which will deliver approximately £231 million of support for disabled children and their families, and for the first time in Scotland, see people able to apply for disability benefit online. I'm delighted to confirm that the regulations for child disability payment have been laid before Parliament, making an important milestone in the devolution of disability benefits. This budget also recognises the important role carers play in supporting those with disabilities or long-term conditions, with a further £306 million for carers allowance and £42 million for carers allowance supplement to provide financial assistance to carers. COVID continues to be a central consideration in Social Security and of this whole government. We have extended eligibility for the £500 self-isolation grant to everyone on an income below the level of the real living wage, so people who are self-isolating do not have to choose between supporting themselves and their families financially and isolating to help break the chains of transmission and protect public health. Additionally, we're investing £41 million, including local authority administration, in the Scottish Welfare Fund to enable local authorities to provide essential help to the most vulnerable people in their communities. Additionally, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance announced further measures in the budget statement yesterday, which included an additional £25 million to tackle poverty and inequality this year, and £100 million to support low-income households next year. While the pandemic means we are living and working in uncertain times and we continue to respond and replan as necessary, we remain refocused on building a new system for people of Scotland with dignity, fairness and respect at its heart. And I look forward to the next steps for social security that this budget supports, and of course welcome any questions from the committee this morning.
Cabinet Secretary, thank you very much for that, and I'd be very supportive of many of the social security policy initiatives that the Scottish Government's taken forward, and I'm sure other members of the committee will want to ask more questions about those and scrutinise those going forward. So I almost apologise for asking a dry and dusty question to start off the evidence session. Of course, underpinning all these really positive policy initiatives has to be the structure of Social Security Scotland itself, and making sure we're getting value for money out of the systems that are put in place. And as a budget process we're looking at, so I suppose I want to start off by just looking at the administration costs that underpin a lot of those benefits that are being paid out. You can see the administration budget for Social Security Scotland goes up significantly in the coming financial year, from £186 million in the last year to £271 million this year. Could you say just a little bit more about the reasons for those increases?
Certainly. Well, quite simply, Social Security Scotland's budget needs to increase because the agency will be delivering more in the next financial year. I mentioned in my opening remarks, of course, around the child disability payment, which is an important milestone. But we will, of course, also be preparing for the introduction of the adult disability payment. And we have to have the staff and the facilities available to us to allow the delivery of that benefit, the onboarding of new staff, the training, the induction of new staff is therefore very, very important. And that's why the increase in the administration budget for Social Security Scotland increases next year. That has been laid out, that kind of trajectory has been laid out in the programme business case, which was submitted last year.
So can I just check then, and I apologise, I'm not an expert in the programme business case, but I do know that it was a revised business case in February 2020, and that, I'm just looking at it here, suggested total development and running costs of just over £300 million in 2021, rising to £380 million in 21-22. So are the earlier figures I put on the record in relation to the other running costs, are these figures consistent with the revised business case as produced in February 2020?
Well, what you will see is slight changes in what was in the business case, because obviously we've had to replan the programme because of COVID. So what people will see is a difference in the phasing of our implementation costs over the remaining years of the programme, and differences in the development of Social Security Scotland's administration costs. We don't expect the overall cost of the programme or indeed of Social Security Scotland to increase, but what I say you will see is a difference in the phasing. So we would expect to stay within the overall programme business case envelope, but it will be phased differently in future years. One other aspect which wasn't included in the programme business case, which will show up in the budget for Social Security Scotland, is that the programme business case didn't include transfers of function between the Scottish Government and Social Security Scotland. So, for example, the transfer of the Chief Digital Officers Division is now planned for the year 21-22, and that will, of course, make a difference to where that money shows up in a budget line, but doesn't make a difference to the overall cost of the delivery of the programme.
I've got a few more brief questions on this issue. I'm keen for members to go on to some of the kind of meaty policy decisions as well. Cabinet Secretary, I'm sure you are. The committee's spoken a lot in the past about one-off costs in relation to setting up Scotland or expanding what is now an established social security system for Scotland. and there's talk of what the steady state costs are and what those one-off costs are. So what's the recurring cost that will be embedded into future spend, and what is kind of one-off investment. So I don't know if there is a kind of breakdown in relation to the uplift from £186 million in the last year to £271 million in the coming financial year. How much of that will be steady state costs, if you like, or how much of that is doing the heavy lifting to further develop the Social Security Scotland in the first place?
Well, I can come back to committee with particular details on the figures if my answer doesn't go into enough detail for you, convener, at this point. But in essence, the costs that are being seen that are increasing for this year are because of the staff that we will be taking on to deliver benefits. So obviously those will be staff that we will have on a permanent basis as we move forward. So in essence, the reason that the agency is costing more next year, as I go back to the point, it's doing more, and it's also taking on functions that were currently previously within the Scottish Government, such as the Chief Digital Officer, and that's the reason why those increases have been happening, is around staff costs and the ability to build the agency, and of course everything that comes with the staff, including training equipment and facilities, workspaces, and so on.
I think that's a really important point, and one that I hope a successor Social Security Committee will focus in on again, because I'm sure they will come back to whether we're getting value for money out of the administration of Social Security Scotland. But of course, the more localised you make a service, the more face-to-face opportunities you give for individuals to engage with Social Security Scotland, the more expensive it becomes, because staff costs play a significant role of that. So it would be quite useful, I think, in future budget scrutinies, maybe to get some of the information in relation to that. So when we're looking at the actual delivery costs, administration for Social Security Scotland, we can compare that with, like, if you like, staff to claimant ratio, for example. There's maybe a little bit of work to be done on that. I'm just wondering, once we, and maybe you could come back on that as well, but this will be my final question. Once we strip out the agency costs, so the benefits which now the Scottish Government pays for but are delivered under agency agreements with the DWP, once you strip out those costs, is there a kind of envelope which you try to work out, well, here's how much money Social Security Scotland's paying out, and here's the administration costs, and there's a ratio between the monies we're giving out from Social Security Scotland and the costs of the administration of Social Security Scotland? Is there a target in relation to what that looks like? And I do get that you could, if only we had the money to do it, you could substantially increase benefits overnight, and the administration costs might not change, but the monies going out would dramatically increase. So it's not an exact science. But is there a ratio that the Scottish Government looks for to say, well, for every pound we spend in administration, we would expect to deliver so many pounds out in benefits to people in Scotland? So what considerations did the Scottish Government take in relation to that?
Well, it's a very important point to analyse what is being delivered for the money, and I would say that, I suppose, point back to the programme business case in many ways, because the business case said that we would expect the agency under steady state for our cost of administration to be around 5% of benefits administered. And that's broadly in line with the DWP, although, as you yourself pointed out, convener, we will be doing things differently to the DWP. So certainly what you will see over a point as we are building up to steady state, you will see that percentage being higher than 5%. But I give you the example again that at one point later on this year, we will have brought on all the staff to deliver adult disability payment, but we will not be delivering adult disability payment at that time. So there will, of course, be times where we have a higher percentage in terms of the administration to benefits expenditure, but that's because we've brought on the staff who are just about to deliver a new, as particularly in the case of adult disability, a very, very large benefit. So we will see fluctuations in that percentage over time as we reach steady state, as we bring on more staff to deliver more benefits. But I go back to the point that around steady state, we would expect to be roughly around the same envelope as the DWP currently are.
Okay, that's helpful. I did say that was my last question. I'm just going to indulge myself as convener a little bit more. I suppose what I'm trying to do is set out baselines for future social security committees. So at 5%, and you can see I'm not in the finance committee because my maths ain't always brilliant, Cabinet Secretary, but are you effectively saying for every pound spent in administration, you'd be anticipating putting £20 into the pockets of claimants in Scotland at 5%? And if that is the case, is that the kind of thing that we could use as a kind of baseline going forward as we bring on additional benefits? Is that the same ratio you'd be looking for? And would it the kind of thing a future committee could start to look to say, well, you know, maybe in a couple of years' time, for every pound spent, it's dropped to 18 or up to 25? The Scottish Government would give a rationale for why that has changed, whether that is greater efficiency, less efficiency, or more generous benefit entitlements. It would just be good for the committee or a future committee to be clear about these things.
Well, I won't attempt to do the calculation that you've done, convener, at that point in your earlier question. So I'll leave that calculation aside. But what I would say to the committee is it's very important that we do look at the cost of administration when you compare the administration cost to the benefits administered. But also the committee will have to bear in mind that the cost of administration as a percentage of benefits isn't necessarily a measure of value for money. So, for example, the cost of administration measures economy, but it doesn't look at efficiency or effectiveness. It doesn't look at improved outcomes that we secure for clients. So you could, for example, greatly decrease the cost of administration by not having as many staff on board or not having local delivery offices that we intend to have. But that doesn't make it a good outcome for the client. So as well as looking at the overall cost, quite rightly, we also have to look very carefully at what we're actually delivering for that money as well.
Cabinet Secretary, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I was about to say that we will, of course, look at the value for money in line with the Social Security Scotland Social Security Charter commitments that we have as well, and that's another way that we will look at value for money in this process. Okay,
I'm going to make a final comment, Cabinet Secretary. You don't have to respond to that, but I'm going to bring Rachel Hamilton for a supplementary, and if you want to reflect on my final comment when dealing with that supplementary, that would be welcome. I think it would be helpful.
Thank you, convener.
Rachel, I've still got my final comment to make. Just hold your powder dry a second. I'm going to bring you in rather than go to the Cabinet Secretary once I've made this comment. It would be helpful, Cabinet Secretary, I think, in future when you're reporting on administration costs, including whether that's the 5% target, it would be to set those numbers beside the outcomes for claimants and maybe staff to claimant count ratio, how localised it is, so we don't just see raw data and numbers, which, as you say, might give an idea of what efficiency may or may not look like, but doesn't actually give an idea of the quality of the service. So I think the numbers have to be set beside the lived experience of those that are using the system to give a context to that. Rachel, my apologies, I just wanted to put that on the record. I'll come to you now for your supplementary.
Cabinet Secretary, it was just I noted that the administration of the Scottish Welfare Fund had remained, as I see it, on the line at £5.5 million for the administration. I just wondered, in light of the difficulties that had been experienced with that administration and that calls for that to increase, am I reading this correctly, or was that not taken into consideration in this budget?
Cabinet Secretary?
My apologies, convener. I think there was a problem with my connection at that point, and I completely missed Rachel Hamilton's question. So, with apologies.
So, do you want me to repeat it?
Yes, my apologies. I didn't get any of it, I'm afraid.
It's okay. So I noted that the line on the administration for the Scottish Welfare Fund had remained at 5.5 million, and it was the same for 21-22. And in light of the difficulties that we have been highlighted during COVID over the administration of that, was there any reason that had not been taken into consideration and increased?
So one of the aspects which we've been very careful to discuss with COSLA is around the additional support that local authorities have been required to have because of the increased administrative burden during COVID. So as we've looked to increase the amount that we put into the Scottish Welfare Fund, we also have had discussions with COSLA about additional support, and that includes discussions about the additional support in terms of administration funds for the self-isolation support grant as well. So local authorities will have had increased administration support from the Scottish Government through the COVID pandemic to deal with the additional pressures that they have on. I haven't been able to find the figures as I've been answering that question, but I'm happy to provide that to committee in due course if that would help.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. Keith Brown, MSP.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. You said in your opening remarks that this was an important year because it would see the start of disability benefits being paid. I think in particular you mentioned the child disability payment pilot, and you've also mentioned the adult disability payment as well. Just a comment first. I think I completely agree and would support the idea that properly well-trained staff delivering really good services locally is something worth paying for, and it's a good investment to make. I just wonder if you're able to say anything about whether you expect the pilot for the adult disability payment to start before the end of the financial year. I know you said there'd be perhaps a gap between all the staff being trained up and the service being provided, but do you expect to see some payments be made during the coming financial year?
So we will take on the staff in the correct timeframe to allow us to move straight from their training and induction on to deliverability. But what we are still looking at is what the pilot will look like for the adult disability payment. And that will be a very, very important part of the process for this. So as we look to what the pilot might look like, that will determine what the exact timescale for that will be. As I said in previous sessions with committee and to Parliament, we do intend to move to the adult disability payment pilot in spring 22, but there are some decisions that still need to be made about the model for that, so I will keep the committee updated on that in due course, and that will have an impact on the exact timing of when that will begin.
Thanks for that. Are some of those decisions that you are still to make then really designed to try and resolve some of the uncertainties which have been raised with us by the Scottish Fiscal Commission about how decision making will differ from PIP, which is natural enough when you're devolving and want to do something different with the payment, but they did mention some of the uncertainties created by that. Is that something that these decisions that you're talking about are going to try and address?
Well, certainly what we will see as we go on through this year is different decisions being taken within government, and also, for example, the operational guidance being published around how decisions will be taken. And when we've got to a point where there is much more clarity over the minutiae of how that decision making will happen, that's the type of thing that the Scottish Fiscal Commission needs to be able to see and understand to be able to make the forecast. And they, of course, work very closely with Scottish Government officials to ensure that they have the information that they require to be able to make that forecast. So what you'll see as this develops, just as we've seen with child disability payment, is that the Scottish Fiscal Commission have been able to make a forecast on child disability payment before the pilot took place, but once they have sufficient knowledge to be able to determine how the different application forms might make a difference to benefits, and how the overall way that we will be making decisions will have an impact on how many people may or may not get a benefit. So I think it's not necessarily so much about the pilot, it's about ensuring that we provide the Scottish Fiscal Commission in a timely manner with the operational guidance and the nuances of both the application process and the decision-making process that will allow them to move forward. But it is an area which I know the committee has looked at is a particular challenge understandably for the Scottish Fiscal Commission, because it's very difficult to make forecasting. It's very difficult to do forecasting for a new benefit, particularly when there are changes to processes and changes to applications. And the committee will be aware, just given the general size of the adult disability payment, that a very small difference in forecasting to what happens in reality will make a very big difference to the social security budget, which we of course have to fit because it's a demand-led budget. So there are numerous challenges, but we're working very closely with the Fiscal Commission to get in as good a place as possible to allow them to make as robust a forecast as possible, because that's certainly within our interest as we look forward to the budgets for future years.
Thanks for that. I think that and the exchanges with the convener previously covered the ground that I was looking to cover on the adult disability payment. Just one quick question, if I may, on the child disability payment. Does the government expect Social Security Scotland to be managing this, or how many cases would they expect to be managing by the end of the coming financial year?
So the Scottish Government will be responsible for the 51,000 clients that are receiving either child disability payment or disability living allowance for children. We will begin the transfer of children and young people from daily child to child disability payment in the autumn onwards, and we do expect to see around 650 new applications for child disability payment per month if the process is, and the numbers are approximately the same as what we previously have seen for disability living allowance for children. So it's about, sorry, Convener, it's about 650 new applications per month, and then we will also look at reviews and changes of circumstances, which will put more people onto child disability payment on top of that as well.
Thank you, and thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Brown, and we'll move to our Deputy Convener, Polly McNeill.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I first of all wanted to ask you about the Scottish welfare budget. So it's returned to normal level of 35.5 million, and the Poverty and Inequality Commission raised concerns in their report about the lack of awareness of the Scottish Welfare Fund, and also the variation across local authorities and how it was promoted and applied. Cabinet Secretary, given also the extended eligibility of the self-isolation grant paid from this fund, would the government not want to wait to see, first of all, if they can fix these issues with the number of applicants to the Scottish welfare budget, because there's clearly an unmet need here?
So just to be clear, the money for the self-isolation support grant is in addition to the expenditure on the Scottish Welfare Fund budget, and we wouldn't expect local authorities to have to dip into the Scottish Welfare Fund pot to deal with the self-isolation support grant demand. I appreciate that that's also administered through the Scottish Welfare Fund, but we are looking at the two trains separately. I have, of course, read the Commission report into the Scottish Welfare Fund, which was written very early on in the pandemic, and I know local authorities have been doing a lot of work to ensure that they are assisting people during this time. So has the Scottish Government, for example. We have been looking at what we can do to ensure that people are encouraged to have the benefits and payments that they are entitled to actually given to them, and that's why we've been running a number of national marketing campaigns to encourage, for example, income maximisation and a knowledge of what's out there for people. We have looked very closely, of course, at what is being done within local authorities, and both the officials and myself have had close communication with COSLA around this issue. We are at this point still anticipating an underspend in the budget for the Scottish Welfare Fund during this financial year. That may seem at first instance strange given the pandemic that we are going through, but I would point to the fact that although demand for crisis grants has increased significantly, community care grant applications, which on average are 6 times higher in value, did take a significant dip, particularly early on in the pandemic, and therefore when you look at the total Scottish Welfare Fund budget, we still are anticipating an underspend this year, which will of course be carried forward in local authority budgets into next year.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Does that mean that the promotion that you're doing of the Scottish Welfare Fund, you obviously share these concerns that I have, you don't expect to be successful then if you're still expecting an underspend? And what if the assumption is wrong? What if the uptake starts to improve, which I would hope it would, and you've anticipated an underspend?
Well, just to be clear, we're doing the overall marketing campaigns because we have an overall desire within government to ensure that everybody at this time, particularly those that might not have had any contact with the benefit system before, have a single point of contact that they can go to and know what's available to them. So that's not just about the Scottish Welfare Fund, it's about ensuring that everyone who's out there that's experiencing financial difficulties knows that they can get advice to be able to support them with that. We're anticipating, I go back to the point that we're anticipating an underspend because the level of demand for community care grants, which are, as I said, on average 6 times higher than value than crisis grants, has not been strong this year. And local authorities point directly, particularly during the initial lockdown period, but also for later on in the year. The reason for that was, for example, because the number of new tenancies that were being put into place was significantly lower, and indeed virtually zero for many months. And that's why there's been an underspend. So the government, right at the start of the pandemic, when we didn't quite know how it would impact on local authorities, increased significantly the Scottish Welfare Fund. But what we've seen during that year is variations, particularly in the community care grant, that meant that entire budget might not be required for this year. That's why, for example, we've ensured that money near the end of the year has been given to local authorities in a different way. So not through my portfolio, but through Aileen Campbell's portfolio, looking at a more flexible support for financial insecurity that allows local authorities to help people with food and fuel, etc. So we've dealt with demand in different ways, not just through the Scottish Welfare Fund. As I say, the underspend is due to those variations in year, but that underspend will be kept by the local authorities.
Thank you very much. Further to that, could I ask about the discretionary housing payment fund and why the additional 8 million that during 2020 has not continued to the 21-22 budget? There's a lot of unmet housing need, and it's clear a lot of people are struggling to pay their rent, in particular students, those with recent earnings and those without recourse to public funds. And also, as the committee have been raising in their sessions, those with a mortgage who are on universal credit, who've lost their job through the pandemic, get no assistance from the Social Security. So there's a lot of unmet housing needs. I'm wondering, Cabinet Secretary, why the government have not committed this additional money for the 21-22 budget, given that?
So in many ways this ties into some of the answer that I've just given on the Scottish Welfare Fund. Some of the additional £8 million that was provided as a response to COVID has not been needed this year. We believe that's due to some of the temporary measures that have been put in place, such as the extension to the furlough scheme, the extension to eviction bans, and the £20 increase in universal credit. We are closely monitoring with local authorities the spend on DHPs, but what we have recently agreed with COSLA is a funding methodology that will allow local authorities to benefit from any underspend of the additional funding that they had this year to be rolled forward into next year. So again, this is about the Scottish Government providing additional expenditure to local authorities, the experience on the ground being slightly different to what was perhaps anticipated early on in the pandemic, and the government therefore being flexible with local authorities to ensure that any underspends from this year will move into next year. So hopefully that provides the committee with reassurance that we are working with local authorities to assist in the next financial year too.
And just finally, has the government considered the last point I made there, which is those who are on universal credit have lost their jobs and who have mortgages are not paying rent? Has the government considered that they should be eligible for funds, whether it's probably the discretionary housing payment fund, if they're on universal credit, they would qualify for? Do you happen to know if they're eligible, or has the government considered that there might be a relatively small, medium-sized group who are in this position?
I can perhaps get back to the committee on that point about what's available for homeowners, etc. It may be an issue that I don't deal with directly within my portfolio, and therefore I'm happy to come back to the committee with a further answer in due course.
Thank you. Just to be clear, I appreciate maybe crosses over into the housing portfolio, but I'm talking about those who are on universal credit and will be getting some benefits, but homeowners don't tend to get any funds from Social Security. But in these changing times, given the impact that it's not their fault, they've lost their job, seems to me that the system's going to have to adapt to different people in the system who need some help. But I would be very grateful if the Cabinet Secretary would consider that point and get back to the committee. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thanks, Pauline. We'll go to Sheila Robertson now.
Thank you, Convener. My apologies if the Cabinet Secretary mentioned this earlier. I don't think she did, about the additional 25 million for the council tax reduction. Just to ask, first of all, has that 25 million for council tax reduction, has that been needed? And would the Scottish Government consider making further additions in the 21-22 budget should claims continue at a higher level?
So the £25 million that was there for council tax reduction reserve has been needed due to an increase in claims. I believe that's already been distributed to local authorities on top of the £350 million worth of funding that already goes to them for the council tax reduction scheme. In terms of the budget for next year, it sets out that local authorities will receive an extra £259 million in the current financial year to support COVID pressures, and local authorities may use a proportion of this to cover any additional council tax reduction costs over and above the £351 million provided.
Right, that's helpful. So it's really bundled into that extra money, and the councils would have more flexibility then in terms of how they would spend that. You mentioned earlier on about the £100 million that's in next year's budget to help low-income families. Can you just say a little bit more about what the makeup of that is? Again, is that part of that £259 million? Is it local authorities got quite a high degree of flexibility about the use of that £100 million?
So this is a separate announcement which Kate Forbes made to Parliament yesterday, and that's £100 million which she announced to support low-income households next financial year. We are still due to work through the details of that investment and discussions, as committee would expect, with local authorities and with COSLAs. So we will announce details in due course about that. So I'm afraid I can't say any more about that today, but what we are keen to ensure, as we have tried to do, and successfully in some cases, to ensure that the UK government won't claw back any of the support that's provided, for example, through reduced benefit payments. And we'll be working obviously closely therefore with UK ministers as we look to design any schemes for next year to see that there are no unintended consequences, which means that people in effect actually are no better off from it because of a policy decision at a UK government level.
Okay, thank you for that. Just final question from me, and it's whether the Scottish Government is considering a repeat of the additional carers allowance supplement COVID payment. Is that something that you would consider repeating?
So unfortunately, because of the way that the legislation is designed, repeating a coronavirus carers allowance supplement would require primary legislation going through Parliament. That's obviously not feasible for a June payment given the current pressures on the parliamentary timetable. What we have therefore been very keen to do as we've moved through this process during the pandemic is, in addition to the coronavirus carers allowance supplement that we paid last year, is look at what else can be done to support carers during this. And therefore I go back to the point I was making in introductory remarks, is not just about social security but what's happening in the wider sense of government. So there's obviously therefore been investment into local carers centres and a number of announcements throughout the year on that, additional funding to Young Scot for young carers wellbeing packages, and also funding to support respite care, for example. So what we've been doing as a government is looking at what we can do through social security, but because of the rather blunt measures that we have within social security, it's often easier to support people through different parts of government, and that's what we have done with carers, is look at what we can do in the wider sense to support them.
That's helpful. That's all from me.
Okay. Thank you, Shona. Before I pass on for a supplementary that Rachel Hamilton was trying to get in on earlier, but we'll take her in now. After that supplementary, we're going to pass to our Deputy Convener, Paul McNeill, for a period to convene the meeting, and I'll return shortly. So we'll pass to yourself now, Rachel, for your supplementary.
I'm grateful for that, Convener. It was just some clarification really on the 20 million that was taken from the reserve of the Scottish Welfare Fund to pass on to local authorities, I presume, for the discretionary payments that you're talking about in terms of supporting people with food and fuel. You also mentioned the community's budget allocation, and there was winter plans for social protection as well. So I'm wondering, Cabinet Secretary, is it time, as we kind of try to rebuild but also have COVID implications with rising unemployment, etc., to look at the Scottish welfare funding formula in future budgets?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think it's a very important point that we do reflect on what's been happening in COVID to see if there's lessons learned, and that's fair in social security as it is right across the Scottish Government. I think what we've had to do is learn and adapt as we went on. And as I said, I think in response to Paul and McNeill, we had initially made that overall announcement, a pot of funding announcement for the Scottish Welfare Fund. But as the year progressed, we realised in conjunction with local authorities that what was required was assistance in different ways and allowing local authorities to be more fleet of foot in the situation that was arising. And also because we weren't seeing the pressure on the Scottish Welfare Fund budget that we had perhaps anticipated. Again, that was because of a very, very dramatic reduction in community care grants, which are higher. So sometimes when we're looking at these aspects, particularly in the face of a pandemic, social security is quite a blunt instrument in terms of what's required. And what local authorities, I would say, have been exceptionally good at during the COVID pandemic have been is being fleet of foot and responding particularly to local needs that have happened. Now, does that mean in essence there's something that's inherently wrong with the Scottish Welfare Fund? I don't necessarily think it does. I think the Welfare Fund is exceptionally flexible. It can allow for and does allow for local authority discretion. It does allow, it did allow us to bring in the self-isolation support grant, which was an exceptionally useful, which I think proves in many ways how flexible the Scottish Welfare Fund will be. But we do have to look, as committee would expect, at any lessons that we can learn from this. Now, the Scottish Welfare Fund itself is something which I think works very well in the main in Scotland. I appreciate there were concerns by the Commission at the start of the pandemic, and we're working very closely with COSLA to make sure that the discretionary element of the Scottish Welfare Fund is encouraged in local authorities and they feel empowered to be able to use that.
Rachel,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're moving on to theme 4, uprating, and Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Deputy Convener. I'd like to ask the Cabinet Secretary, if I may, about Best Start Foods. It hasn't been uprated since 2019, and I wonder if the Scottish Government considered uprating it or extending it to children under 4.
So I think again I would point to the fact that the Best Start Foods, when it was introduced, was much more generous than the overall UK Government fund, although now the UK Government have increased their similar package to now the same amount of £4.25. I think as well as considering the fact that it was brought in at a higher level, it also has to be borne in mind that Best Start Foods forms a wider, broader package of support. So along with the Scottish Child Payment and Best Start Grant, that will provide families with over £5,200 worth of financial support for their first child. Obviously, it's slightly less than that for second and subsequent children. So what we have done is look at how we can provide support for families, not just through Best Start Foods, but through other aspects. And I think the wider support package that we have shows that the Scottish Government is taking very serious steps to support children, including those whose families may currently be getting the Best Start foods.
Can I ask? Yes, thank you, Deputy Convener. I mean, we've faced exceptional circumstances this year, but I wonder whether, given the relatively low cost of uprating policy this year, the Scottish Government had discussed whether it could have uprated a wider range of benefits further.
So we, as committee, will be well versed in from previous discussions we've had in previous years around upratings. We have a duty to uprate young carers grant and funeral support payment by inflation, but in recognition of the exceptional circumstances of COVID, I took the decision to increase a wider range of benefits this year. So Best Start grant, Job Start payment, carer grant, funeral support payment and child winter heating assistance by 1%, which obviously is higher than the 0.5% inflation that was required. But on top of the uprating decision, I go back to the point that there are a number of other programmes that are in place to support low-income households, both during the pandemic and in future years, particularly around the Scottish child payment. But we have also responded to the particular concerns around the impact on COVID, for example, around the £100 COVID hardship payment that was made to children, and again the second announcement that was made by Ms Forbes yesterday around a further £100 COVID hardship payment to children and young people in receipt of free school meals. So we're taking very seriously how to support children and young people, families over this time, but that shouldn't and can't just be done through social security. We do need to look at how we can support low-income families in the round, and much of that will be wider than social security.
I have two more questions. One is specifically on support for people during the pandemic, and the Cabinet Secretary in opening noting that the Self-Isolation Support Fund was available to those who earn less than the living wage. I just wondered if the Cabinet Secretary has the information regarding, under current eligibility, how many people are eligible and how many people have taken it up? How many people have required to take it up? That's the Self-Isolation Support Fund.
I will, Convener, once I can find the right page on the self-isolation. In essence, we are looking very carefully at the eligibility of self-isolation support as we move forward with this. We do anticipate the number of people who will go forward for self-isolation support to be now much greater than it would have been, and that's been an increase that we've taken on very seriously. When we looked at the number of people that our modelling suggests could be eligible for the grant if they were required to self-isolate, so this isn't the number of people who will get the grant but could be eligible for the grant if required to self-isolate, we believe that the extensions to this will be 390,000 people. So again, I stress those are not the people we expect to apply and receive the grant, but that could be eligible for the grant if required to self-isolate. Therefore, there will be additional costs next year, and the Scottish Fiscal Commission will be asked to provide costings for that extension in due course.
And at the moment, does the Cabinet Secretary know how many people have taken this up?
It's too early to be able to have figures for the extended eligibility for self-isolation support, if that's what Ms Johnson's asking for, just because of the time period of when that came in, which was earlier in February. So if that's what she's asking about, I'm afraid it's too early to tell at this point, but we will publish figures for self-isolation support grant as we've been doing as soon as we have those figures available. So if I've understood her correctly, then we don't have those figures at that point.
Okay, thank you. I'll pursue that further out with this meeting. Can I just ask a final question? The Scottish Government, has decided that spending £90 million on freezing the council tax, I believe that is a Scottish Government proposal. But I'd just like to understand what other policies were looked at. The council tax freeze, it can certainly be strongly argued. Perhaps it doesn't always help those who need help most. And I'm just wondering if the Scottish Government has looked at any better mechanisms to deliver, more cash into the pockets of low-income families at this time.
Well, I think we try very carefully to look at what we can do and be quite innovative around what we can do with the powers that we have. Part of the challenge, of course, is many of the powers around low-income benefits and our ability to impact on this is still reserved to Westminster. So that does leave us with a limited number of tools that we can provide. And obviously we're looking to help not just families, but those, for example, single households and households without children that may also have been impacted by COVID, that wouldn't be picked up if we were looking at simply doing packages which use, for example, the Scottish Child Payment. So although we are absolutely determined to tackle child poverty, we need to be cognizant of the fact that this pandemic in particular has hit many people in different types of households, and therefore what can we do to provide support to perhaps a wider range of people than we would do when we are looking at what can be done around low-income families, which is where the social security powers that we have are focused on at that point. And that's why I think the aspects around the council tax fees are very important, because it will provide support for people that would not be given if we were looking at the Scottish Child Payment or other aspects in social security. In saying that, we have, of course, not just announced the fees for the council tax, should councils wish to take that up. But again, go back to the points which I think we've mentioned earlier on about some of the announcements that were both in the budget, and then the additional announcements that were made yesterday by Kate Forbes around the further £100 COVID hardship payment to children that will get paid alongside the payments offered for the Easter free school meals. And again, the provision of a school meal equivalent during holidays has been an important policy that has been delivered this year. And as I've also mentioned, so won't dwell on too far, the £100 million support to low-income households that will be provided next financial year, with details to follow after discussions with COSLA.
Thank you, Convener. No further questions.
Pauline, were you going to come in?
Yeah, just a quick thank you, Convener. Just a quick supplementary. Cabinet Secretary, it's just on the widening eligibility for the self-isolation grant and to those who are under the living wage. I mean, if compliance rates don't improve or you were concerned about the compliance rates, might you have to widen that eligibility further? We all have constituents who are in modest incomes, but if they isolate, they will actually lose their pay, because not every employer is willing to continue to pay somebody to isolate. And I think it's one of the things that's actually been missed in all of this. I just wondered if you thought you might have to change the criteria again if compliance rates were still of a concern.
So overall compliance is very high with self-isolation, and we know that one of the ways that we can support that is through financially. But one of the other aspects which we know we will need to take more action on is around employers who are perhaps not being as supportive, if I can put it like that, to people as they should be, to require them to self-isolate. So we know the vast majority of employers are being exceptionally supportive, but we have had concerns raised by individuals and by local authorities that this is one of the main areas of challenge around self-isolation compliance, is a pressure that's been put on individuals to still go to work despite being required to self-isolate, or earlier on about not being allowed to stay at home until they have a test. When it comes to the financial support, though, we have said all along since I first announced the self-isolation support grant that we'll work with local authorities to see if it is doing what it needs to do. Self-isolation is an exceptionally important part of breaking the chain of transmission, and we would continue to look at that if we had an anticipation, or if anything is showing up in the data and feedback from local authorities that there are people who are still finding it difficult to self-isolate. Self-isolation support grant isn't a direct payment which is to replace the full income that a person might lose, but certainly for those that are on less than the real living wage, it should provide them with sufficient financial cover to be.
I understand that. I wasn't asking about people who I accept the people who are below that. My question is, I believe there are hundreds of people who are in moderate incomes who can't isolate because their employers will not pay them. It's those people I wondered if you thought you might have to widen the eligibility for.
Well, it's certainly something, as I say, we would look at if we felt that compliance was an issue. I'm not quite sure what the income level band would be that Ms McNeil's suggesting. If it's not the real living wage, I'm not quite sure if she has a particular income in mind that it should be increased.
There are people, I don't know what you would consider to be a modest income, but there are people who are above the living wage. You've got single parents who might just be above, the level. You've got people on 20,000, 22,000, I would regard as a modest income. But they've got employers and not trade. I mean, I could send you constituents who I know are in this situation right now, and who don't get sick pay, or they don't have those terms and conditions, and they don't have trade unions. And they tell me that if they had to isolate, they don't know what they would do. So there's plenty of people, I don't know, you would regard as a moderate income, but I think and those are the people that they wouldn't. It's not a question of them not wanting to isolate, it's a question that they can't afford to. And I just think government should think ahead. If you were still concerned about that, then there should be a wider group of people you can consider. Thank you.
Well, certainly it's something which we will keep under review, because we are taking the compliance issue, as the committee would expect, exceptionally seriously. If we're still seeing people who are saying that they can't self-isolate due to financial pressures, of course this is something that we would look at. And as I think I've said during the debate that we recently had on self-isolation, this is an area I'm very keen to work across the chamber with, particularly because people will be having constituents who are coming to them with particular experiences. So that feedback, along with the feedback from local authorities, is very much something that we take very seriously as we move forward for this. And we're very open to the fact that we will need to be adaptive to the circumstances on this to make sure that this is working. So hopefully I could reassure Pauline McNeill that we are taking it very seriously, and I'm more than happy to continue to work with her and with others on this issue.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Mark Griffin.
Thanks, Convener. Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I just wanted to come in and welcome the Government's decision to double the uprating rate of 0.5% to 1% from CPI for low income assistance. And the Cabinet Secretary will know that we've had debates about uprating levels in the past, and a concern that I have about whether CPI adequately reflects the increasing costs that low income households bear every year. And that's why I welcome this decision. I just wanted to ask the Cabinet Secretary if you would consider a policy of not just ad hoc increasing of the uprating rate, but actually whether the Government would consider what was a minimum floor for uprating of low-income entitlements, so that it wasn't just an annual decision whether to go beyond CPI or not, whether the Government would consider a longer-term approach to a minimum level of uprating.
So the longer-term approach is set out in our response that we've set out to the committee in previous years, and again we'll do this year, around why CPI is the correct measure. I won't rehearse all the arguments for that again for the benefit of time today. I'm sure we'll come back to it as we discuss uprating at committee for this year, but certainly my view is still very much, if we are looking at uprating, which is there to ensure that benefits keep pace with the rate of inflation, then CPI is the correct measure for that. The decision that I took this year is specifically around the fact that we are in an exceptional year this year, and therefore I felt it was important to increase not just the benefits that we are required to uprate, but a wider set of benefits than that, and by more than the rate of inflation, and that's due to the exceptional circumstances within this year. Our longer term policy is as laid out within the discussion papers which we presented to committee last year, and will do so again this year.
Okay, thanks, Cabinet Secretary. Look forward to that discussion.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And we'll go to theme 5 now, and I think we'll take Jeremy Balfour in now because I don't think he's an opportunity to ask a question yet. Jeremy.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just a couple of questions. The first one, just around the risk for this budget. Obviously, we are in uncharted waters for the next 12 months. What, for you, are the major issues around the risk for the budget? And obviously, with it being demand-led, how does Scottish Government see that being mitigated if required?
Yes, so these are challenging times to ensure that we are keeping close control over budgets, but as Jeremy Balfour quite rightly points out, these are demand-led, so if we are required to pay, we of course do so. This year has been in many ways remarkably stable considering the current circumstances that we've been in. There's been some expenditure that's been higher than forecast, around funeral support payment, for example, but that's been offset by lower expenditure in other areas, for example, attendance allowance. There has been, as committee will appreciate, challenges in estimating the expenditure as we move forward, both of the year that we've gone through and the year that we're about to enter into. Some of that is because we're dependent on information from the DWP, but they are also under exceptionally challenging times about anticipating what benefit demand for the reserve benefits might look like. Obviously, there's a great deal of that will be impacted on decisions elsewhere within the UK government, for example, around what happens to furlough. So, of course, we saw significant increases in universal credit claims this year, which has had an impact on the variance month for month. In many ways, though, in the year that we're in just now, the additional expenditure has been where we've chosen to provide additional support, whether that's the Coronavirus Carers Allowance Supplement or the additional payments to the Scottish Welfare Fund, or of course the Self-Isolation Support Grant I should mention as well. Looking to next year, there is a substantial amount of risk associated with the budget next year, given the scale of the expenditure that we're now responsible for. I think the Scottish Fiscal Commission themselves have pointed out that it's difficult to predict demand-led expenditure in normal times, but it's even more difficult under circumstances such as COVID. But we're working very closely with the Fiscal Commission as they develop their forecasts for next year, and of which we've delivered our budget to meet. The committee will be aware that our budget is set based on the Scottish Fiscal Commission forecasts. There is obviously a challenge as well that the money that the Scottish Government gets is based on block grant adjustments, which are decided at a UK level. So there is that challenge of ensuring that there is the money coming into the Scottish Government to meet what the Scottish Fiscal Commission thinks we will be required to spend. Obviously, if there's a change in that and we see that in year, we will adapt in year to it. And of course, the Scottish Government has borrowing powers and limited borrowed and limited reserve stocks that we would have to use if we're required to make any adjustments between financial years. So it's quite a complex picture at the best of times, but I think it would be fair to say even more complex than we would normally have.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. If I could just ask in two benefits then. The kind of discussions I'm having with some of the third sector is that they think there's quite a lot of built up in demand around PIP attendance allowance, simply because people haven't been able to get the advice, they haven't put in the applications forms. Is that something that you envisage, and how does that work? If there is a greater increase of number of people applying, is that covered within the agreement that you have with DWP, or is that extra money that the Scottish Government has to find?
So the demand, the new applications for PIP are now returning to what we'd have expected pre-pandemic at this point, although absolutely there was a quite sharp decrease during the early months of the pandemic. What happens depends on whether these aspects are noticeable in the financial year or not. So, for example, the block grant adjustments are reconciled twice in a year. There's an in-year reconciliation that happens, and then there's a final reconciliation that happens and is applied the following year. So we will be working closely with DWP and with UK Treasury around these aspects, because you would assume, and it looks likely from the figures both within Scotland and UK, that if there has been a decrease in demand in Scotland because of the reasons that Jeremy Balfour would suggest, it would also be the same pent-up demand in the rest of the UK, which in essence would therefore be covered by those block grant adjustments. the timing of those, as I said, as I detailed earlier, is something which is reconciled twice. So I hope that answers the question that Jeremy Balfour posed around what impact that would have and how we would intend to cover it and what impact it would have, particularly on the Scottish Government budget.
Yeah, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That's really helpful. My final question is around the rollout of the child DLA benefit. The Fiscal Commission have, in their evidence to us last week, indicated that they think there'll be greater demand for this benefit or greater take-up for this benefit. And one of the reasons that they gave to us was that it will be perhaps better advertised, that more people will be able to apply. What measures are you taking so that people are aware of this new of the benefit, and how do you see it being kind of advertised across Scotland so that parents can apply?
Well, Jeremy Balfour raises a very important point that the Fiscal Commission has suggested that the cost may increase in Scotland, and that's partly because of a more simplified application process and also because of the decision-making process as well. The aspects around encouraging people to apply and also people having faith that the system will be simple for them to proceed through is really important. As the committee would expect, we would intend to do the same types of work, although they are all different depending on the benefit, but the same types of work that we do to encourage take-up in terms of our extensive work with stakeholders to ensure that they know what's happening, trusted networks of people, and we see that being developed already within the 3 local authority pilot areas so that the stakeholders in those areas are aware of what's happening. But also as we move to the full national rollout, of course we'll look very carefully at what more needs to be done at a national level. We have in many ways a unique benefit in bringing in something that's new that will raise the profile of this. And the challenge we always put to ourselves is how can we make the most of that first impact that we can have as something is launched. And I'm sure Mr Balfour and other MSPs will play their role in encouraging constituents to come forward on this as well. But we're determined to do, as the committee would expect, a lot of work on benefit take-up in child disability as we do with all the other benefits.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And my final question is, as you mentioned at the start, the regulations for these benefits have been laid by yourself, and I think they come to us as committee either next week or the week after. The regulations are fairly similar to the regulations that apply at the moment. I was interested in your comment that you made there. Do you see the interpretation of these regulations by the Scottish agency being different to how they are interpreted at the moment by DWP, thus leading to more likely people getting an award? And how will that be monitored by yourself and by the agency?
Yeah, well, the regulations will be very similar, and we've made no bones about that because we require that for safe and secure transition. But what we are attempting to do through the decision-making process is ensure that people are perhaps more aware of the information that they need to provide in the application form to allow the case manager to make the best possible decision for them and to get the maximum benefit that those people are entitled to. So the way that you can change the application form and the way you therefore have the information available in front of a case manager may therefore lead to more applicants receiving awards or applicants receiving higher awards than they might have intended, because we've been able to design the application form in a way where they are being able to present all the information that's required for a case manager to be able to make a decision. And that might have been missed in the way that an application form is completed through the DWP process. but we worked very carefully to ensure that this is designed with the people who will be filling in the application forms to ensure that they're providing the information that we need to make the right decision, and that therefore might have an implication to the number or rate of awards that are given at the end.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
Okay, thank you, Mr Balfour. I don't have any other bids for questions, Cabinet Secretary, so I know you're staying with us, but thank you for your evidence on our budget security and senior officials who were there supporting you this morning. And we now move to agenda item 3, which is subordinate legislation. The committee will take evidence on the First Tier Tribunal for Scotland Social Security Chamber Allocation of Functions Amendment Regulations 2021, which is subject to the affirmative procedure. So, it seems that you've never been away, but can I welcome back Shirley Somerville, Cabinet Secretary for Social Security and Older People, joined by your officials, Ruth Steele, Head of Funerals, Resolutions and Early Years Benefits, and Stephanie Virlejeux, Solicitor. Can invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement, and then there perhaps may be some questions from MSPs. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. I'll keep my remarks brief. The committee will probably be pleased to know. The First Tier Tribunal for Scotland Social Security Chamber Allocation of Functions Amendment Regulations before you today have been brought forward to facilitate the continuation of the period of assignment of the temporary President of the Social Security Chamber. These amendment regulations make changes to the allocation of function regulations which extend the period for which the assignment to the Social Security Chamber of a President who is also the President of another chamber of the First Tier Tribunal is permitted. We have been engaging with the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service since last summer. The recruitment of a President via the Judicial Appointments Board for Scotland would have been challenging at any time over the past 12 months due to capacity issues and competing recruitments. We think it is sensible to retain the expertise of the temporary Chamber President to manage the more challenging appeal process that will be required for the initial delivery of disability benefits and to ensure consistency and certainty in the effective disposal of social security appeals. Allowing for the continuation of the period of assignment until the 31st of March 2024 broadly aligns with the deliverability of disability benefits, and this will allow for appropriate judicial training arrangements to be put in place. However, these amendment regulations do not prevent Scottish ministers from appointing a permanent Chamber President in consultation with the Lord President before that date if circumstances suggest that it is the right thing to do. In the course of amending the regulations, we consulted with the President of the Scottish Tribunals and members of the Judicial Reference Group, including the Lord President's private office and the Judicial Office. Thank you, Convener.
And we have got a question from Jeremy Balfour, MSP.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'm just wondering if you can give me a wee bit more information why a 3-year delay. I could understand a 1-year delay or even an 18-month. 3 years does seem to be quite a long period of time to be able to appoint an appropriate person, and I just wondered why you think a 3-year. I appreciate you can bring it forward, but why such a long period before a person would be appointed?
Well, Jeremy Balfour raises a very important point, and it was something which was given a great deal of consideration. I think what we've tried to do during this set of regulations is deal with the challenges that we have of setting these regulations in the middle of a pandemic which hasn't finished yet, at a point where we are still requiring to see the impact of the pandemic fully on social security and indeed on the court service. What we have, I think, is a very is a cautious approach in terms of the fact that I can't see us having to come back to committee again to extend this. But also what we can do is, as I said in my opening remarks, move to a full appointment at any time. So I suppose these regulations are a kind of belt and braces approach where we have went for something that really might not be necessary but ensures that we don't have to be back in committee at any point if there's any unforeseen circumstances, either within the courts or within social security, but it gives us the flexibility to move out of this temporary arrangement as soon as we can. So hopefully that gives Mr Balfour the reassurance that we've attempted to make this as flexible a system as possible, and one which we may very well not need the full time for.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you.
Okay, Mr Balfour. Pauline McNeill.
Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned the deliverability of disability benefits, and you also mentioned additional training. It was just to highlight that it's an issue that I'd raised previously about some concern in the past about wide disparity of judgments in social security, and I wondered if Cabinet Secretary thought to the future that when we get to the point of judgments being made on the basis of the new arrangements for disability benefits, so there might be some scope to monitor those judgments, certainly in the early years. Just some consideration of that would be useful.
Well, I think it's something that Ms McNeill obviously had an interest with for some time, and she'll be well aware that the training is not something which is the responsibility of the Scottish Government, and rightly so for that separation. It may be an issue that the committee, for example, may wish to look at as well. So within what is within the Scottish Government remit, we'll obviously keep a close eye on aspects. I'm sure within the judicial services these aspects will be looked at, but the actual training, how that's delivered and the implications of that is quite rightly not something for the Scottish Government.
Thank you very much.
I don't see any other questions from members, so we'll now move to agenda item 4, still on the same element of subordinate legislation, and can invite Ms Somerville to move motion S5M 23951 that the Social Security Committee recommends the first year tribunal for Scotland Social Security Chamber allocation of function amendment regulation 21 draft be approved. Could you move that at this point, please, Cabinet Secretary?
Moved, Convener.
There is technically the opportunity for a debate that they're not normally taken, but there is the opportunity for any member, if they wish to drop a comment or a request in the chat box just now. I don't see that, so I'm therefore suspecting the Cabinet does not need to sum up in that debate that didn't take place. So it just remains for me to ask, is the committee content to recommend approval of this instrument? Again, I will check the chat box. If anyone dissents from recommend approval of this instrument, please put it in the chat box now. Okay, there being no dissent, that is approved. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and her officials for attendance today, and we'll now move to the next agenda item, which is agenda item 5, still on subordinate legislation. Can I refer members to paper 5, note by the clerk. The committee is invited to consider the Council Tax Reduction Scotland Amendment No. 2, Regulations 2021, SSI 2021/51, which is subject to the negative procedure. The instrument makes amendments to the Council Tax Reduction Scotland Regulations 2012 and the Council Tax Reduction State Pension Credit Scotland Regulations 2012 to uprate various allowances and premiums and to make minor amendments following exit from the European Union. Are members content to note this instrument? Again, I'll wait to see if I see anything in the chat box, and if not, I will assume members are content to note this instrument. There have been nothing in the chat box. I can confirm that we are content to note the instrument. And as previously agreed, we will now move to agenda item 6, which we will take in private session on a different platform. So if I can close the public part of the meeting, and I'll see members shortly on MS Teams. Thank you.